Chapter 23. Luckily, this is a short one, so let's get to it. There's your key terms. So, as globalization came to characterize the worldwide community, right, Western ideas about art were taken up and adapted by many different cultures around the world, just like, Americans would travel to Italy, Germans would travel to Italy, France, like everybody would travel everywhere. I mean, it's the same idea. It's just that those ideas are much more easily accessible, right? So, art world is a term that embraces artists, curators, dealers, collectors, journalists, critics, and other art professionals. So, the following 11 artists are discussed in this chapter as a representation of the diversity within the modern art world. So, I won't linger but this is one of the first ones, Yinka Shonibare, and this piece is called The Big Three. So she's known for installations featuring headless mannequins dressed in 18th or 19th century style clothing made of colorful African cloths, just like this piece here. And then another one of her pieces that she's well known for is Cake Man. Essentially, it's about greed and the burden of carrying wealth and never having enough, right? It's always kind of the goal of everyone is to have more wealth, but even when you get more, you don't have enough, right? It's kind of a terrible American ideal that just always weighs us down. And I'm sure a lot of people are feeling that even more right now with everything that's going on. So this is a photograph by Nermeen Hammam. It's called Armed Innocence 2 from Cairo Year 1 UPECA from 2011. So during the early days of the Egyptian Revolution, Nermeen went to Tehran Square to photograph the arrival of the Egyptian army, and she titled her series of photographs Upekkha, after the Buddhist practice equanimity, of maintaining mental serenity in the face of events, so as to see things clearly. It's absolutely beautiful. And they're so young. It's crazy. But that's the cost of war sometimes, I guess, huh? And then this one is by Imran Qureshi, Blessings Upon the Land of My Love from 2011. So Qureshi here employs the conventions and techniques of Mughal painting to portray what at first glance appears to be the aftermath of a violent incident. But when we look really closely, it reveals the pools of blood are composed of radiating petals of flowers. So Qureshi actually was going to school to become a miniature painter, and then found out that he really loved other materials and mediums and started doing this. And I'm so glad that he did, because it's so cool and so beautiful and so highly detail oriented. It's amazing to look at. And then Gupta. This is called A Very Hungry God from 2006. It's a really sad story that brought about this piece. But basically, he heard a story that an organization in France was distributing pork soup to the hungry, knowing full well that many observant Muslims and Jews could not eat it, and yet they were still putting it out there for them to eat. So this is his grinning symbol of death, which is really beautiful and really dark all at the same time. Versus this piece, which is a much happier story, perpetuates his culture's generous aesthetic of abundance in purely secular terms, right? So named for the Hindu word for grandfather, as well as the European art movement. It depicts a banyan tree, the national tree of India, bristling with stainless steel pails, canisters, pots, pitchers, bowls, colanders, tiffin carriers, cups, spoons, ladles, and more, replacing earlier vessels of pottery and copper. So they are shining symbols of progress and rising living conditions in India. So this one is a really happy story behind it, right? So he's not always gloom and death and all those other things. So these are the rest of the artists that we're going to look at in this chapter. So this is by Feng Mengbo, Long March Restart. So if you don't know what the Long March is, it's a famous event in the 20th century early Chinese history, covering some 8,000 miles in 370 days. The march marked the rise to prominence of Mao Zedong, who established the People's Republic of China when the Red Army finally triumphed in 1949, so he made a video game literally talking about it. Very modern day aesthetic and mentality to something that happened quite a while ago that was very awful, right? And then Saw Pete Pitch. This is called Fertile Land, a non-representational piece that hovers between painting and sculpture, made of bamboo from the countryside and rattan harvested in the mountains. Its grid crossing secured with tight twists of wire. It's painted with earth pigments that Pitch gathered on travels around Cambodia and mixed with materials such as charcoal, warmed wax, and resin made by boiling sap. So burlap from used rice bags adds texture. This piece and pieces like it, quote unquote, represent for me a kind of distillation of emotion or remembrance, of reflections on what has influenced me or the places I have been. Which I'm sure we've all had thoughts of doing things like that. I know I have. I don't think it's just an artistic mentality. And then Kohei Nawa, Pixel Deer number 24 from 2011. So his bead series, or Pixel bead series, includes toys, musical instruments, shoes, and numerous taxidermy animals, just like this deer. So the animals carry a special charge since they were once alive, and even a taxidermy, they retain a lifelike presence and texture. So in the Japanese Shinto belief, deer appear as messengers of the kami, nature spirits, and natural phenomenon that are worshipped as sacred beings. Deer are also associated with Buddha. If you guys remember, he gave his first sermon at Deer Park. And then this is quite possibly definitely one of my top 3, if not my favorite piece from this chapter. It's by Damian Ortega. It's called Harvest. So this is how you would view it in person, right? But then this image gives you an idea of what he was actually going for. So basically he based this piece off of handwriting by his mother, who was an elementary school teacher, and so she had beautiful handwriting. So from the front, they just look like twisted, gnarled pieces of metal, but when the shadows are cast by the lights above, it shows and reveals the alphabet. So homage both to handwriting, almost maybe lost art form, right, and to his mother at the same time. And then Jenny Saville, many of us are familiar with this one. Rosetta 2 fleshes her subject, and she likes to work from photos or live models, including herself. She also likes to have herself or live models get nude and then press them up against glass panels, and then she paints from images from that, which is very interesting. The whole idea of flesh and sexuality and all sorts of other ideas are going in there, but she's an amazing painter, for sure. And then the last piece from the chapter and from the book is Ernesto Neto's Leviathan Thought. It was an installation in the Pantheon in Paris in 2006. So he transformed the cavernous neoclassical interior into a sensuous, mysterious place filled with pendulous organic forms. Elongated nylon sacks hung like soft translucent stalactites from an open-work fabric membrane overhead, which you can see here in this last one. So interesting, that contrast of those organic forms in this very regimented, classical space. And that's the bottom of it. And this is very similar to the image in the book. It's almost like a sci-fi, weird installation set in a very classical, traditionally beautiful space. That contrast is really interesting to me.